Okay, we're going to finish filling out our 2.1 note sheet by doing some work in StatCrunch. So if you're logged into MyLabs Plus, you can go to the StatCrunch tab, and you're going to have a couple options. You can open data sets from your textbook if you need to here, or you can just launch the website, and that's what we want to do right now. And we're going to open StatCrunch. Basically, it looks like an Excel document once you get in there. Okay, if you ever need to open a data set that I've shared with you, you're going to go to Data, Load, and Shared. And at this point, you can search for what you want to look for. I title everything that I share beginning with my first name, Donahoe. If you just search that, you should get a nice list of all the options and be able to pick from there. If you know exactly what I've titled it, this is NCAA, you can type that in as well, and your data should come up and you can load that. So here's the same data that we had in our note sheet, all of the different goals scored. And we're going to do a few things with this. What might be nice right now is if you have your Chapter 2 StatCrunch commands document open or out next to you while we're doing this, you can follow along with that, and you can follow along with me on the screen. So the first thing we already made in our notes was we made a frequency table. So we are going to go ahead and remake another one of those. So if we want to go to Stat Tables Frequency, we can create a frequency table. The only column we have is goals. We are interested in a frequency table, and I do not need to choose any of the other options. Notice that creates the exact same frequency table that we just created by hand in the other video. I'm going to go ahead and keep this available, just keep it off to the side. Okay, now the first graph that we want to create in our note sheets is we want to create a dot plot. So I'm going to go to Graph and find dot plot. Again, I'm going to choose Goals. You've got options here. You can make your dots larger or smaller based on your preference, so you can mess around with those settings. You can allow your points to overlap or not if you want to. And there are a lot of other options here. If you're making a graph to actually turn in, it's nice to actually add some labels on here. So our x-axis would be goals. Our y-axis here is frequency. And we could add a title. Something like that. But these are all just to make your graph look a little bit nicer. You don't necessarily need them to get the point of the graph. We hit compute, and here's what this looks like. This is what a dot plot looks like. So for every value, for the value of 9, there was 1 goal scored, so there's 1 dot. For the value of 11, there were 4 goals scored, so there are 4 dots there. And so you can see what a dot plot looks like. Again, feel free to mess around. You can always just go back to your options and edit if you want to change anything. You could make your dots very large, and you can kind of mess around with different options there. So I'm actually going to, if you hit the X button, it just tosses it up here, and it's not completely gone. You can always open it back up if you want to, but it gets it off your screen and out of the way. So there's an example of a dot plot. The next one we want to make is a frequency histogram, and if you have your paper out, your notes, it says to use bins that start at 9 and have a width of 3. So we're going to follow those directions. We're going to go to Graph Histogram for our goals. So notice we do have some options here. We have to tell it where to start. So we want to start at 9 with bin width of 3. You certainly don't have to do this, but I like to choose this option to put the value above the bar. I think it just makes it easier to read. Again, you could add some titles here if it were something that you needed to formally turn in, but if I'm just doing it to get an idea for a homework problem, I don't necessarily need to do that. So here is what is our frequency histogram here. So you can see what I mean by it's nice to have the numbers on top of the bars in case there's any discrepancy about where that actually falls on the y-axis. Also, let's talk about the bins, and let's talk about that right-hand rule that we talked about in our notes. So notice these are of width 3, and what this is saying here is it says it includes the number 9 and not the number 12. So this bar right here is representing 9, 10, and 11 goals being scored. So if we go over here and we look at 9, 10, and 11, notice that there are 5 goals that fall into that category, and that's why we have a bar of height 5. The right-hand rule comes into play by this boundary, this number 12 right here. 12 is on the boundary, and it technically goes into this bin, the bin on its right. So this bin represents goals 12, 13, and 14. So if you look at goals 12, 13, and 14 over here in our frequency table, you can see that there are 9 in there. That's why we are bars of height 9. But that's what the right-hand rule just means. So like the 15 is technically counted in the right-hand bar. Now it says next in our notes to maybe just toy around with making your bins wider or narrower and see what you think about that. So possibly, what if we made our bars of width 1? Now every single goal has its own bar, which is helpful in a way because we get a little bit more information from that. However, it's starting to get a little bit hard to look at possibly. So there's good and bad for making your bin sizes larger or smaller. We could edit again and maybe we make them much larger. At this point, I feel like we've lost way too much detail. This is hardly telling me anything at all because goals 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 are all counted in this one bar. And there's a big difference between scoring those. I think there's a big difference between scoring 9 and 14 goals. So this maybe at this point has lost a lot of detail, maybe too much to be helpful to your reader. But that's always something to toy around with, to check out. I'm going to go back to the default of 3. I think that was a pretty good one. Fairly easy to read, shows enough detail without showing too much. So now another option on the next thing on your note sheet is to turn it into a relative frequency histogram. So remember, relative frequency just means that instead of the actual counts here, instead of saying 2 goals, 4 goals, 6 goals, I want to change these into percentages. For us, all we have to do is go back under our options here and change it from frequency to relative frequency. And StatCrunch does that for us. So now we can say that there are 18% of the goals that fall between the 9 to 11, and 32% of them are in that 12 to 14 category. So now we've got them all as percentages. Okay, I'm going to toss that up here. And the very last graph or a visual we want to look at right now is we want to look at a stem plot or a stem and leaf plot. So we can choose that. Choose our goals. Now one thing you do want to be careful about here, it's defaulted on what it says outlier trimming. So if you look at your data, you might right now see how that could possibly be a problem. If we see how 35 is quite far out from the rest of these numbers, so if I leave it on the outlier trimming of extreme only, it's going to actually not include 35 in the visual. It's going to just mention it later. But you can kind of see what they mean by a stem and leaf plot. So our stems here are the 0s, the 1s, and the 2s. And then these over here, these values are our leaves. And in order to read this, I read this as, this means 9, a 0 in the 10s, and a 9 in the 1s. And I read this as a 1, 1 is 11, 1, 1 is another 11, 1, 1, 1, 1. So there are 4 11s, and then a 1, 2 being a 12, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3 are my 13s, and etc. Now sometimes they might just have one very, very long leaf here for all of the ones, but StatCrunch decided since there were so many of those, it just decided to split them up at the 5 mark here and make 2 different leaves out of that. So you could always go back in here and say don't trim the outliers, and you can see how at that point then they go on up and they include the 35 in the visual. You can see though why you would only want to do something like this for a small amount of data values. If I had thousands of numbers, I certainly would not choose to look at them this way. This would be too overwhelming. Okay, this should finish up your 2.1 notes.